The next chart actually starts to look at the current data. As I just mentioned, there were about 1.3 million people who reported at least one Aboriginal ancestor. That meant they could have said anything in combination, but they would have had to have said at least a Métis response or a North American Indian and or Inuit response to that question. The count of people reporting an Aboriginal identity, that is, they said I am Aboriginal, and then they listed, they checked one of the three boxes, North American Indian, Métis, or Inuit, was roughly 976,000. And for those of you who have the binder, all of these slides are in there, so you don't have to write down every number you see. And I'm hoping the organizers will somehow make this available in some way. The North American Indian count was about 609,000, and the Métis count this time was 292,000, and we'll talk about the growth of that population in a minute. There were 45,000 who said they were Inuit, and then there were multiple responses, and there were only about 6,000 or so multiple responses, but we also add in those people who say they have registered Indian status but no Aboriginal identity, or they have band membership and they have no Aboriginal identity. So there's about another 25 or so thousand that said that. So they're also included in the identity population count. How am I doing, Tom? I want to make sure I get through all this. Okay. Let's.
8 or 9 minutes.
Great. This looks at the growth of the Aboriginal population from 1996 to 2001. And as you can see, the demographic story here is the Métis population growing by 43% in 5 years. That's huge, demographically speaking. And so we'll talk a bit about why that has happened, but certainly you're aware of a number of events that have been affecting the Métis population. And we'll look at their fertility in a moment, because fertility is not explaining all of this. And while the Métis population has a high fertility rate, this is births per woman. It's called the total fertility rate. This is based on a colleague of mine recently who used census data to tease out the fertility rates of each of the Aboriginal groups, as well as we have the Canadian rate there just as a benchmark. But you can see the Métis birth rate at between the 96 2001 period was averaged at 2.15 births per woman, about 50% higher than the Canadian rate. But it has been, in fact, more or less declining in the last 10 or 15 years, as has the Inuit and as has the Indian population birth rate. So while it's high, it is declining. So, and in fact, to account for a growth of the population, which I'll take you, oops, no, not yet, the growth of the population of 43%, there's no way demographically the maximum growth rate that demographers think is theoretically possible is 5.5% per year. The Métis population between 1996 and 2001 was growing at 7% per year. So what's going on here? Well, if you look around the room, I did a little check on how many. First of all, the overall growth was about 92,000 people between 96 and 2001, 90,000 people increase in the Métis population. There are only about 80,000 Métis women in the childbearing ages. So that's a lot of births in 5 years. So that's not what is explaining this. People are changing their ethnic or their identity affiliations from one census to the next. People are suddenly identifying where they haven't maybe identified before. That's the conclusion we come to. Let me show you why. In this chart, I got to do this sort of one graph at a time. What I've done here in this chart is I looked at 5-year age cohorts. I'm going to turn you guys into demographers. Demographers love looking at age groups and how they age over time. So this is looking at the 5-year age cohort, 96 to 2001. So what should happen if once a cohort is born and the population isn't affected by external migration from other countries, which the Aboriginal population isn't. It's very minor change due to immigration and emigration. The population should only change by fertility and mortality. okay? Which means that once a cohort is born, the only thing that should happen to it is it should decline over time because there's nothing else to increase that population, fertility already having happened, right? So what you would expect that once a given age group is born that it should decline by over the next 5 years. Well, let's see what happens in certain groups. I hope this works. Yeah. This is the registered or status Indian growth in the cohorts. We get a bit of growth in the younger age groups, probably due to late reporting of births to the register. That's a whole other issue I won't bore you with today. But essentially it's behaving reasonably normally. Most of the age groups are, in fact, below zero growth. That means they've declined in the 5 years. There's a little bit of increase in the older age groups. Might be some leftover C31s who are gaining status, et cetera, and now are declaring themselves. Let's look at the next one. This is the Inuit population. Again, a fairly closed population looking like the registered Indians. So basically, most of the cohorts are declining over time. But look at the Métis. This is the Métis population where you have a growth in the cohort, which should be declining, that is being less than 0% over time, growing at between 20 and 30 plus percent in 5 years. So people are clearly, either our coverage of census has improved a lot, which it may have done with the Métis population, especially given the interest in the data for the Aboriginal People Survey, where we had a Métis supplementary survey, which I'm sure many of you know about. But I don't think improvement in coverage would have covered this kind of growth. So it suggests that people are, in fact, declaring themselves from differently than what they did in the last census.